All right, everybody. So this is lecture 3 for module 5, and we're going to go over, let's see, the Modern Mammy and the Angry Black Man, African American professionals' experiences with gendered racism in the workplace. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so we're going to talk for just a brief second kind of about the overarching theme. The overarching theme of this is that Black men and Black women experience stereotypes of racism differently within the workplace. So by that, I mean, just because a person is Black does not mean that racism comes out in a specific set of criteria. Now, this does generally come out with consequences of less pay, less hireability, less things of that nature compared to white individuals. However, there are variations within Black women and Black male individuals. And that's kind of what we're going to get into here and what Wingfield was really writing about. So we're going to talk about the women first. The women stereotypes are the mammy, the welfare queen, and these are just overarchingly, by the way, and this is displayed a lot in media. This is displayed, these stereotypes are perpetuated over and over and over again within our society. A reminder and a note, stereotypes are not and should not ever be considered actually how someone of any identity interacts or engages with the world. These are stereotypes because they are and continue to create systems of power and inequality and allow for the ability of control of these bodies. And so we need to make sure that we are thoroughly engaging with the fact that stereotype is a negative thing and that these things do not represent how Black men and women are in actual life. So stereotypes of these women, again, moving back to that, are the mammy, which we'll get into, but is kind of this idea that they are caregivers or are going to gear towards work as opposed to their own necessarily household or their own responsibilities, because that work ethic or that desire to care for their job comes first and it's primary. It's kind of those ideologies surrounding maybe how Black women were treated in hospitality type situations and or how they are continued to be treated in wealthy white homes, and this idea that, well, they are going to bend over backwards for me or raising my children or what have you, because, here is more important than at home, or their job is so needed that they are going to deal with some of the situations that we might put them in. The welfare queen being that wretched stereotype that Black women consistently have more kids than they can economically afford. And so they are just, in order to garner resources from the government to make this super wealthy way of living, which no one can have on resources from the government. So there's been a multitude of research and things dispelling the fact that per capita people on welfare are consistently more of people of color. And there's also been a plethora of research dispelling the idea that you can get rich on all of the government aid, because you cannot. The erotic sex symbol, or this ideology of this exotic, right? So you're going to see that a lot when you see any kind of media surrounding Black women as hypersexualized versus white women, or they're going to be seen as not necessarily this idea of what is sexy, but this idea of what is willing to do whatever. And there's a very key distinction there. We've talked previously about the negative imaging that happens for people of color within media, within advertisements, within things like this, and how that standard of beauty is centered on whiteness. Really with this is the idea that because they are not the norm or what have you, that they can be fetishized in a way that is unhealthy and derogatory. And so that's just not a stereotype that we want to perpetuate, but it does come up in the workplace because it comes up as these workers can be fetishized in weird ways and or be victims of sexual harassment in different ways than white women might experience that, or especially in different ways than Black men would experience that, right? You also see the idea of the bitch or the educated bitch being someone that knows too much or is cocky or is too educated for their own good and wants to tell the white man off kind of ideology. This is taking something that is incredibly positive and that someone has worked for incredibly hard and making it negative in order to imply that they can still be less than and thus be treated less than. So make no mistake that there's an intentionality to that that allows for the continued discrimination of those individuals, right? And the bitch, again, just being that anybody that stands up for themselves, or any woman, especially a woman of color that stands up for themselves, is going to be considered a bitch, right? They're going to be considered bossy. They're going to be considered controlling, blah, de, da, yada, yada, yada. Okay. So those are kind of some of the stereotypes women, Black women specifically, see a lot of in the workplace. They're considered more desirable, however, as workers than men, and mostly that comes back down to that stereotype of the mammy, right, where they're going to put that job before their home. They're going to put that job before anything because they need it, because otherwise they're going to be the welfare queen, or yada 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 yada, right? So really, these stereotypes are working in ways that, compared to the very aggressive type stereotypes that the Black men are getting, are working to make them more desirable to employ, but in ways that they feel like, because they're easier to control or because there won't be negative consequences for controlling them. And so it's not necessarily a positive thing. It is something, however, that is different than Black men experience. So that's something to really think about. They are expected to sacrifice, again, typically for their white bosses, their white male bosses. They very rarely are promoted to positions where they get to have authority over white men. And that is something we consistently see throughout many, many, many workplaces. They're expected to avoid causing trouble, but if they do cause trouble, or, and I'm putting big air quotes around that, cause trouble, right? If they do stand up for themselves, their emotions are not considered threats, and they're usually very much shrugged off or minimalized in very real ways. Because again, they're looking at that in very different ways than they're looking at Black men and how they might handle or stand up for themselves, or how those standing up for themselves might interplay with those male stereotypes, right? If women are standing up for themselves, they're a bitch. If men are standing up for themselves, they're a threat. And those are very, very, very different reactions, and they get very, very different reactions. Now, those are, again, stereotypical ideologies of what is happening, not necessarily what is actually happening. And again, they're sexualized very much by their white colleagues. However, they do experience a little bit more of in-group dynamics, so they are allowed to intermingle with coworkers in different ways, but that comes at the risk of being sexualized and being discriminated against or harassed for that, for being female and Black. So that's kind of the things that women experience. Men, on the other hand, kind of have some contradictory things or ways in which they experience workplace discrimination that are different. So their stereotypes that they often are attributed are the criminal or the thug, right? You see this a lot in media, where in most cop dramas, the bad guy is a person of color, a male person of color, but consistently Black men are viewed as these criminalistic or threat or angry kind of ideology, right? They're looked at as the only emotion that they have is anger, and they're going to display it in a very physically negative way, right? Which is unrealistic, because all humans have a wider range of emotion than angry. And so that's just not statistically possible. And it's been dispelled multiple times. Again, this falls all the way back to this ideology post Jim Crow, or really that allowed Jim Crow, where they really had this myth of the Black rapist that really followed around Black men in a ways that they could easily arrest them or blame things on them or make up stories against them to consistently cause them harm in ways or keep them in a judicial system instead of slavery, to continue the control of Black male bodies, right? And this continues today. They simultaneously are considered lazy or deadbeats. So you see a lot of things like, well, they're a deadbeat dad, or they're not going to really be engaged in their family life anyway. So their families aren't going to be as important to them, and they're lazy. They don't want to do anything. They're always high, whatever. Again, these stereotypes are meant to create to make them other in a way that can dehumanize them, and it's intentional. On the flip side of that, they're also considered the athlete, right? So the hyper fit, their performance body, like that their body is used for their performance, and then their performance is sport, which I think is interesting, because when you juxtapose those two things, they shouldn't exist in the same sphere, but both of which are used in ways to make them seem criminal in different ways, right? So they're either lazy and they're a pothead, or which again is ironic given the level of drug use comparisons across race, or they're an athlete and they're a violent criminal, right? They can be a violent criminal because, I mean, they're physically fit. Look at it, and they're bound to do something angry and lash out irrationally at us. Okay, so like, again, these things are all used as a form of control to make sure that Black male bodies stay considered something that is not a normative, stay something that is considered not appealing, stay something that is considered not promotable. Because if we can do all three of those things, then we have to consider them a human, and we have to give them the same rights and lack of discrimination as we would maybe a white man, right? And that's just not where society aims to be at this point. Now, again, I am not perpetuating that discrimination is okay. I am just stating that the way in which this control, the reason these stereotypes exist, are to maintain control within the system that they operate in. So, and how that plays out in work is kind of different than how the women played out in work. The men must try and avoid getting angry, and felt like even if they were rightfully angry, they weren't allowed to display that in any form or fashion, because, or even when discrimination occurred, they weren't allowed to display that, because they would be feeding into those stereotypes in ways that might get them fired or might get them othered and even more outcast, right? They were excluded from work groups primarily because, again, if you're considered the threat, that's very different than you're considered a sex symbol or something that we want to engage with, right? Like, those two things are very different, and they impacted the men and women in very, very different ways. Now, neither one of them, again, are positive. However, it does affect indifference. There's a different way. They were also considered suspects, so they were less desirable workers, because regardless of qualifications, because again, they were thought of as this idea of this criminal or this threatening thing that could possibly do harm to the company or ourselves or the image of the company, or yada, 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 yada. So again, really, the main points I want you to get out of this is not necessarily to know specifically every type of stereotype and what they were used for, but that these stereotypes overarchingly were used as a form of control, and that they are consistently there within workplace environments to make it so that Black men and women face racism and discrimination in very, very different ways. Okay, so that's kind of really what this article is getting down to. I hope you learn something from this article so that someday when you all are bosses or bosses, that you can really cater to and or garner a different work experience for your peers. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and hop off here, and then I think we have a couple more in this section and we will move on. All right, have a great day.